The morning light was soft, the kind that dulled edges and gave the steel in the yard a cold bluish hue. Ronald Joseph Pseudo stepped out of his truck, boots hitting gravel with a slow crunch. In his right hand he carried a black metal thermos, worn from years of use. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of diesel and oil, the familiar perfume of the worksite. He crossed the lot at an unhurried pace, nodding to a coworker who waved from him across the yard. The sound of an idling engine rumbled somewhere behind him, joined by the distant metallic clang of chains being moved. He reached a large metal trash container, its hulking size slick with condensation, and ran a gloved hand over the cold steel, feeling for jagged edges. This was routine for Ronald. Check first, then work second. The truck he'd been working alongside idled a short distance away, its paint dulled from years in the elements, with its rear frame glinting faintly in the gray light. Ronald walked its perimeter once, scanning for alignment and clearance, and then motioned to the driver. Now, we don't know exactly what his job was, but he was probably a sanitation worker or refuse truck helper / operator. But whatever he was, the backup alarm on this truck began its steady high-pitched warning tone as the truck crept backward toward the container. Ronald stepped into the gap to guide the driver in, eyes flickering between the truck's slow approach and the stationary mass of the container. The air was filled with mechanical noise, the whine of hydraulics, the thump of tires over gravel, and the constant beeping. Then, in an instant, the rhythm broke. The careful creep became a jolt. The truck lurched backward with sudden force, with the gravel popping under the tires as the tonnage of steel surged toward the container. Ronald had barely begun to twist his body out of the way when the space behind him vanished. His back slammed into the container, the cold steel biting through his jacket, a heartbeat before the truck's massive frame crushed into his chest. The sound was awful, a deep, wet crunch as his ribs snapped inward, shattering like dry sticks. The force drove the air from his lungs in a single strangled gasp. His spine bent violently, vertebrae compressing with a sharp, cracking report. His internal organs shifted and ruptured under the pressure. The trauma was so sudden and complete it left no room for a scream. His right glove slipped from the steel and fell, landing palm up on the gravel. His left hand pressed weakly against the truck's frame, fingers twitching once before going still. The beeping alarm droned on, indifferent to the damage it had just accompanied. Shouts erupted, "Stop, stop, stop!" but the driver, already hitting the brakes, could only watch in horror as the momentum carried on for that last fraction of a second. The hiss of air brakes filled the yard as the truck rolled forward to release the pressure, but Ronald's body sagged as the space opened. His knees gave away first, and he slid down the face of the container, leaving a smear of dark red across the cold steel. He collapsed onto the gravel with a dull, heavy thud. The blood began pooling immediately, spreading between the stones. It was thick and almost black in the dim light. Two co-workers ran to him, dropping to their knees. One pressed both hands hard to his crushed chest, their palms immediately slick and hot with blood. The other shouted in the radio for medics, their voice cracking as they tried to stay coherent. But Ronald's eyes were already glassy, fixed somewhere past the morning sky. His chest didn't rise, his mouth hung slightly open, and a faint trace of blood at the corner. His injuries were catastrophic, ribs driven deep into his lungs, his spine was fractured, and internal bleeding flooded through his torso. Realistically, there was no coming back from this. But the sirens arrived minutes later, their wail cutting through the stunned silence that had gripped the yard. Paramedics knelt over him, working quickly at first, but it was clear within moments. The weight of the crushing force had destroyed him internally beyond repair. A clean white sheet was pulled over his still form. It was 9:40 a.m. Within hours, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration had been notified. Their investigation would later reconstruct what happened with cold precision. Ronald had completed dumping a metal trash container and had set it back on the ground behind the truck. While he was still in the narrow clearance between the container and the truck, the vehicle reversed, closing the gap in seconds. The rear end of the truck slammed the container forward, trapping him in the pinch point between two unyielding walls of steel. The investigation determined the cause as fatal crushing trauma, catastrophic compression injuries to his torso and spine. They listed contributing factors: the dangerously tight clearance, Ronald's position with the hazard zone, and the movement of the truck without ensuring the area was clear. Their final note was blunt. Employee was killed when he was pinned between a reversing truck and a metal container. In the official record, it was classified as a preventable workplace fatality, basically a death that should never have happened. Ronald Joseph Pseudo was pronounced dead at the scene. By June 2004, the beaches of Cancun were packed with tourists from all over the world, including families from the US, eager for sun and adrenaline. The Rivera family had flown in from Miami, and their 9-year-old daughter Sophia had begged for days to go parasailing. It was her first time, and she had no fear, just wide, excited eyes and a smile that stretched ear to ear as she waited for her turn by the dock. The parasailing company set her up quickly. Her harness was clipped in, oversized but secure, and the parachute lay flat on the sand behind the boat. She gave her parents a final wave before the boat throttled forward and lifted her into the air. The rope behind her stretched tight as the parasail caught wind, and Sophia was quickly floating above the ocean, her legs dangling freely, arms raised. She was in the air for less than 2 minutes before the wind shifted. A powerful gust from inland, yanking the parachute sideways and dragging her off course. The tow line began to snap at strange angles. The boat below struggled to correct its heading. Witnesses saw the parasail jerk twice in the sky, then would come a sickening snap. The tow line snapped in midair, clean sharp like a whip cracking. The parachute, now detached from the boat, continued flying, but with no guidance. Wind turned it into a rogue sail, and it pulled Sophia violently toward the shoreline. Her small body swung beneath the canopy like a rag doll. She then began to gain speed, and far too much. Bystanders on the beach would scream. The parasail cleared palm trees and flew over the pool area. It would continue toward the massive concrete structure of the hotel, and now she was completely helpless. There was no way to steer or stop this parasail, and she would strike the third-floor balcony at full speed. The collision was brutal. Her legs hit the steel railing first, with her bones snapping instantly, the sound loud and sickening, like thick branches breaking under weight. The force of the impact drove her left shin completely backward, bending at the wrong angle. Her right femur shattered mid-thigh, with her bones tearing through the skin, visibly protruding, with white streaks stained red in an instant. Her body flipped and her head slammed directly into the edge of the concrete column. Blood would explode everywhere across the wall. Her skull struck with such a force that a crack formed along the side of the balcony. The sound of the impact of flesh, bone, and skull against concrete was heard by near guests who described it as a violent, hollow thud followed by silence. Her left arm folded under her as she hit the tile floor. Her shoulder dislocated completely. The arm twisted behind her, with the socket bulging unnaturally against the skin. Glass from the balcony door shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, several embedded in her right cheek, throat, and chest. Blood would pour from the gashes, mixing with the pool of dark red already spreading beneath her head. It was so bad that a 6-inch shard was lodged in her upper abdomen, pulsing slightly with every shallow breath she managed to take. She was tangled in the remains of the parachute, limbs bent at sickening angles, her face pale beneath the blood. Her mouth was open and lips twitching. She gasped once, blood bubbling between her teeth, and then fell limp. The hotel guest inside the room stood frozen for several seconds before stepping onto the balcony. The sight was grotesque. The child was basically unrecognizable now. Her face was swollen, lips split open, and the skin around her eye already turning purple. Her nose had been completely flattened, and the skin on her forehead had a split in a Y-shaped tear, exposing the bone beneath. The guest, like probably anyone else, turned and would vomit. Hotel staff rushed to the floor within minutes. One maid screamed and dropped the linen she was carrying. Others tried to shield guests from seeing the scene. The entire hallway outside the third floor was dead silent, except for muffling cries and the distant wail of sirens. Security personnel entered the room first, stepping over shards of glass and chunks of broken railing to reach her. Surprisingly, she was still alive, but barely. When paramedics did arrive, they found Sophia clinging to life. Her breathing was wet and raspy, with each inhale sounding like it was coming through a straw half submerged in water. Her legs were almost completely destroyed. As I said earlier, torn skin, shattered bones, and muscles visibly ripped and twitching. One foot had partially detached. Her airway was compromised by the blood in her mouth and throat, and the glass in her neck had nicked a vein, which would make blood pulse out with each beat of her weakening heart. They quickly intubated her, suctioning blood from her throat as fast as it poured in. Her pulse was thready, flickering between 40 and 60. The paramedics could feel her slipping. She was then rushed to the ambulance, trailing streaks of blood down the hotel hallway and into the lobby where stunned guests stood in silence. Her parents followed close behind, her mother sobbing, screaming for someone to help, with her father speechless and numb. At the hospital, doctors assessed the full extent of her injuries. Her skull was fractured in 3 places. She had a severe traumatic brain injury with brain swelling, a collapsed lung, and a punctured abdomen, with multiple compound fractures. One of her ribs had broken and pierced her left lung, which was filling rapidly with blood. The team inserted chest tubes, performed a procedure to relieve pressure in her skull, and tried to stabilize her with blood transfusions. But unfortunately, her blood pressure crashed repeatedly. At one point, her body went into full circulatory shock. Her extremities turned bluish-gray, with her pupils dilated. The ECG readings jumped wildly between pulses, then flatlined, then came back. The trauma team would work for over an hour, but unfortunately, Sophia succumbed to her injuries. Police reports confirmed that the girl's father, Carlos Enrique Torres, filed a police complaint against 4 individuals involved in renting out the Parasailing service. 2 of them were detained for questioning by Mexican authorities. However, there are no public records of any lawsuit happening, nor do we know what happened to the other 4 guys involved in this. It was a quiet late summer morning in Nokesville, Virginia. The sky was pale blue, thin clouds drifting lazily overhead. On the Vanderwood property, the grass still held beads of dew glistening wherever the sunlight touched. Thomas S. Vanderwood was outside tending to a few small chores. These chores didn't really demand much thought, just moving tools and checking fence lines. The air was warm enough to draw sweat if you worked too quickly, but the slow pace made it pleasant. Somewhere nearby, his youngest son, Josie, was out in the yard. Josie, who had Down syndrome, loved to explore. He could spend hours walking the property, running his fingers through the tall grass, poking at the dirt with a stick, or following the family dog as it wandered. And this morning seemed no different. A distant bark from the dog cut through the silence. Then, faint but distinct, Thomas heard a sound that didn't fit. A muffled splash, heavy and thick, close enough to raise his attention. He would walk towards this noise. At the far end of the yard sat the septic tank, its rectangular opening exposed, the plywood cover pushed aside. As Thomas reached it, the stench hit him first, overpowering like rotting eggs and ammonia burning the inside of his nose. He would then look down. 8 to 10 feet below the surface of raw sewage was churning. And in the middle of it, Josie thrashed, his mouth opening in a desperate gulp before going under again. His hands scraped the interior wall, leaving faint streaks in the black slime coating the concrete. The liquid closed over his head, bubbles breaking where he had gone under. Thomas didn't pause to think. He swung his legs into the opening and dropped down. The instant his boots plunged into the tank, the foul, thick liquid swallowed them with a sucking pull. Disgustingly warm, and it clung to his clothes like tar. The smell was suffocating, coating his throat and making every breath a fight not to gag. The lava rose to his waist, then his chest, and the resistance was immense, each movement dragging at his muscles. He shoved forward, forcing himself toward Josie, whose face broke the surface again in a coughing, sputtering gasp. Thomas slid his arms under his son's chest, yanking him upward until only his legs remained submerged. Josie choked and coughed violently, sewage spraying from his mouth and nose. Thomas locked his grip, his hands slick with the thick filth clinging to them, and he planted his boots on the slimy bottom. He pushed Josie's head higher, trying to give him as much air as possible. The tank's walls rose straight and smooth above them, no ladder and no grip. The fumes burned in Thomas's lungs. His eyes watered so badly that he could barely see. Each breath was shallow, hot, and foul, with the air heavy with methane and hydrogen sulfide. These gases did more than just reek. They displaced oxygen in the air, starving the body with every breath. Hydrogen sulfide in particular at high concentration kills the sense of smell entirely, striking quickly with dizziness and confusion. Also the paralysis of the respiratory muscles. And Thomas's muscles were weakening faster now, his body burning through what little clean air remained in his blood. The sludge tugged at them both. Josie's body felt heavier with each passing second, his legs kicking weakly, with his head resting more against Thomas's shoulder. Still, Thomas refused to loosen his hold. He shifted his stance and the sludge, the suction tugging at his boots, pulling him down further. But by the time others reached the opening, Thomas was up to his shoulders in the liquid, his mouth dangerously close to going under. They would grab Josie first, hauling him into the sunlight. He collapsed onto the ground, hacking and spitting, his skin and hair streaked with foul water. But when they reached for Thomas, his head had already dipped under. The surface rippled once where he'd gone below. Hands would reach in, dragging him up and out. His body was heavy, water and waste pouring from his clothes in a steady stream. His face was pale beneath the filth, lips tinged blue, and his eyes half opened and fixed. They laid him on the grass, sewage pooling beneath his head and shoulders. Someone began chest compressions, each push forcing thick, foul liquid from his mouth in gurgling spurts. The combination of drowning and toxic gas inhalation had done its work. His lungs had filled with sewage, and the methane and hydrogen sulfide in the tank had displaced the oxygen in his blood, shutting down his brain and heart in minutes. The confined space, smooth walls, and thick oxygen-depleted air made self-rescue impossible. Even with rapid intervention, the damage was irreversible. Thomas S. Vanderwood had given every breath he could to keep his son alive. Josie would survive, but his father did not.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
Stansbury Island extends into the Great Salt Lake like a blunt spear with its ridges bare and sculpted by the wind. The trail here isn't marked so much as traced, and what I mean by that is it's like a faint weave through rocks and scrubs that have been worn in by decades of hikers, hunters, and the occasional stray antelope. In early March, snow melt clings in the shaded pockets, while the sun bakes the open slopes to a pale chalky dust. 3 hikers, 2 women and a man, were making their way down toward the trailhead after several hours on the island's higher ground. Going up had been slow but uneventful, but going down was another story. The ground here was steep in certain sections, and recent moisture from the snowmelt had left the soil slick. Flat stone surfaces were covered in a film of grit that looked harmless until a foot slid across it. One of the women led this group, watching her steps carefully but moving with confidence. Up ahead sat a boulder about 4 feet across, shaped like a giant loaf of bread. One side worn smooth by years of weather. It was partly embedded in this slope, sitting at a slight angle. It looked solid enough to use as a stepping point before continuing the descent. So she placed her foot right on it, and the rock responded instantly. Instead of holding firm like she probably thought, it shifted beneath her weight with a low grinding pop, the sound of stone breaking free from the dirt and smaller rocks holding it in place. Her boots skidded, throwing her forward. In the same motion, the boulder broke loose entirely and began to roll down. It was fast, a little too fast to react. The slab of stone, close to a ton in weight, slammed into her shins, knocking her backward on the slope. She hit the ground hard, and before she could push herself away, the boulder kept coming. It rolled up and over her legs across her hips and came to rest squarely on top of her lower body. The impact was brutal. Her breath left in a sharp gasp that cut halfway off. Her legs were pinned flat, twisted at odd angles beneath the rock. One boot pointed outward, and the other was buried completely under the stone. Her husband and her friend rushed to her side, dropping to their knees, clawing at the edges of the boulder to get a grip. Their fingers scraped across its cold, wet surface, but it wouldn't move. They pushed with everything they had, muscles trembling, but the stone was sunk too deep into the soft ground. She was pale, with her eyes open, breath short and fast. A dark, wet stain began to spread in the dirt under her right hip, seeping steadily from where her pants had torn. Her hands reached for her husband's, gripping hard enough to turn her knuckles white. She tried to speak, but it came out faint and ragged. They shouted for help, voices echoing across the slope. The first people to arrive tried the same, lifting prying with sticks and bits of wood. But nothing. The boulder felt like it had fused with the earth. Every attempt only seemed to wedge it deeper into the ground. Rescue crews from the nearby county began arriving within minutes, carrying ropes, levers, and shovels. They circled the scene, working quickly but carefully. Moving the rock the wrong way could cause it to shift further into her side or make it slide down the slope entirely. The ground around it was very unstable, crumbling underfoot. The team tried long pry bars first, wedging them under the edges to lift it even a few inches. The wood would crack and the metal bars groaned, but the rock barely moved, unsurprisingly. They switched to a hydraulic spreader, sliding the tool's arms into a gap at the base. The machine whined as it pushed, with the rock shifting slightly before settling back down. Dirt and small stones fell away into thin streams, revealing more of the slope's loose underlayer. She flinched with every movement of this boulder, the pressure on her hips and legs sending fresh waves of pain up her body. Her skin was turning gray, lips pale, and breath slower now. The stain beneath her had spread wider, mixing with the damp soil into a dark mud that clung to her clothes. One rescuer knelt down beside her, speaking softly, keeping her eyes open, telling her exactly what they were doing, step by step. The work dragged on. The afternoon light began to fade, and the cold would creep in. Crews rotated out on the hydraulic tool, their hands stiff from gripping the controls. Each fraction of an inch gained was held with wooden blocks, then another pushed, then more blocking. Slowly the boulder began to rise high enough for a gap to be formed. After nearly 4 hours on the slope, they were finally able to roll it out to a short distance away. The space where it had been was a shallow depression pressed flat by the weight. The rescuers moved in immediately, sliding her onto a stretcher. Her clothing was shredded at the lower half, dirt and blood smeared across her skin, and her legs lay limp, with the outlines of broken bones visibly under the fabric. They carried her down the slope, but carefully not to joist her. The hikers who had gathered stood back in silence. Their faces were pale in the fading lights. A blanket was pulled over her as the rescuers reached the waiting vehicle. At this vehicle, paramedics would work frantically on her, but the damage was beyond repair. The massive pelvic fractures had torn open major blood vessels, and the prolonged entrapment had sent her into a irreversible shock. She was pronounced dead at the scene from catastrophic internal bleeding and crushed trauma. In the days that would follow this, the details of what happened spread quickly through Utah's hiking community and beyond. Local news were able to identify her as 37-year-old Sarah Knight, a Salt Lake City resident. A memorial was held a week later. It was a cold January morning in 2014, the kind where the air in Montreal cut sharply against the face and commuters pull scarves tightly around their necks. At Fabre Metro Station, the flow of people moved steadily through the ticket gates, past the tiled walls and toward the long escalators that carried riders down to the platform. The station's main escalator was in constant motion, metal steps clattering upward on one side, downward on the other, their grooved surfaces glinting under the fluorescent lights. The familiar hum of the machinery mixed with the echoes of boots on tile and the occasional distant sound of a train arriving. Among the riders was a 47-year-old woman dressed for the weather. She had a winter coat zipped to the collar, gloves on her hands, and a long scarf wrapped multiple times around her neck. She stepped onto the escalator heading down, her gloved hand resting lightly on the black rubber handrail. The ride was routine, the sort of daily movement that barely registered in thoughts. Now, partway down, something changed. It might have been the brush of fabric against the moving machinery, an edge of the scarf hanging a little too low, a loop trailing near the comb plate where the steps meet the landing. But the moment the cloth caught, the effect was immediate. The scarf was pulled downward into the narrow gap between the metal step and the fixed comb at the base. The motion was relentless. The escalator's mechanical force fed the scarf deeper into the slot, winding it tighter against her neck with each passing second. The initial tug would have been surprising, but within moments it turned into a crushing pull. The fabric bit into her neck, compressing the airway. Her hands went to her neck, clawing at the tightening loop. But the draw of the machine overpowered any attempt to loosen it. Witnesses on the escalator saw her jerk forward suddenly, with her posture collapsing toward the landing. Some shouted for the operator, others scrambled to reach the emergency stop button mounted at the side. But by the time someone slammed it, the scarf had clenched hard against her neck, the coarse weave pressing into the skin. She fell to her knees at the bottom, her body angled awkwardly across the final steps. Her coat was twisted, with one sleeve bunched near her shoulder where the material had also been drawn toward the gap. A few strands of hair loosened from under her hat were caught with the scarf, pulled tight enough to strain at the roots. Bystanders rushed in, with one trying to pull the scarf free, but the fabric was jammed deep into the machinery, pinched between the step and the comb plates. Another person tried to cut it with a pocket knife, sawing frantically at the woven loops, but the tension made it almost impossible to get the blade between the cloth and her skin without cutting her. Her face had begun to change color, first flushed from the struggle, then darkening around the lips. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and the muscles in her neck straining against the pressure. Each attempt to draw breath in came with a faint rasp, then shorter gasps, then nothing audible at all. When Metro staff arrived with tools, they worked to remove the step panel, but the delay was agonizing. Those closest could see the deep groove the scarf had carved into her skin of her neck, reddened and already starting to bruise. Her glove hands slackened their grip on the fabric, fingers curling limply as strength faded. Paramedics were called the moment the emergency stop button was hit, and their arrival brought a flurry of activity. They cut away parts of her clothing to get the obstruction away. With the scarf still embedded in the machinery, they focused on freeing her neck, but the indentation was severe. They began CPR on the station floor, with the sounds of compression echoing in the now quiet escalator bay. For several minutes, the paramedics alternated between chest compressions and rescue breaths, their hands moving with practiced speed. But the scarf's grip and the prolonged lack of oxygen had already done extensive harm. They placed her on a stretcher, with continuing resuscitation efforts as she was wheeled through the station and into the waiting ambulance. The coroner's later examination pieced together the exact mechanics. The scarf, measured at roughly 157 centimeters in length, had looped into the step gap at the landing, dragged down by the motion of the escalator. As it was pulled in, it formed a noose-like constriction against her throat. The pressure on her airway and blood vessels had been enough to cause rapid loss of consciousness, followed by asphyxiation. There was some uncertainty about whether her hair had been caught first, causing her to bend toward the step and then draw in the scarf, or whether the scarf itself was the initial point of entrapment. But without eyewitnesses seeing the exact instant it happened, both scenarios remain possible. The injuries to her neck were consistent with forceful strangulation by ligature. The compression had also left impressions in the skin matching the weave of the scarf. Unfortunately, she died on the scene by not being able to breathe. The coroner later ruled the cause of death as accidental strangulation. The investigation found no mechanical defect in the escalator itself. It had actually functioned as designed, which tragically meant it had the power to draw in anything that crossed the gap at its base. The laundry rooms in the Lake apartments in Houston, Texas were all the same. Narrow spaces with concrete floors, humming machines, and the faint mix of detergent and warm fabric. There was one that sat tucked into the corner of the property, its door propped open with a cinder block. Kids passed by it all afternoon, darting between courtyards and stairwells as their games went on. One of these kids was 10-year-old Fernando Hernandez Jr. He had a habit of picking the most unexpected hiding spots. That day, he slipped into a laundry room at one end of the complex. The smell of fabric softener was heavy in the air. Against the wall, a stacked washer and dryer sat idle. The dryer was front-loading, its round glass door closed over a metal drum, big enough for him to curl up inside. He opened it, climbed in, and pulled the door shut. The latch clicked in place, and inside, the curved metal walls surrounded him. There was no air movement, no way to open the door easily from where he was wedged. What he couldn't have known was that the machine had an electrical fault, a hidden hazard that could energize parts of the drum. Somewhere in the cramped space, his skin made contact with this energized metal. The electrical current surged through him instantly. At that voltage, the shock would have caused his muscles to seize so hard that he wouldn't have been able to let go. His chest tightened, his jaw locked, and his heart rhythm was thrown into chaos. The shock was enough to cause immediate cardiac arrest. From the outside, the dryer looked unchanged. So the game went on, and minutes would pass. When another child finally came into the laundry room, they spotted a shape through the glass. It was Fernando. He was slumped in an unnatural position. His head was bent, his body twisted slightly against the drum. They opened the door and he didn't move. His skin was pale, with a faint bluish tinge around his lips. His eyes were partly open and there was small irregular burns on his hands and forearms. Tiny patterned spots where the metal's energized surface had touched him. His limbs were limp, with his fingers curling slightly. Shouts rang out into the courtyard. Adults rushed in. Someone pulled him out and laid him flat on the tile floor. His body hit the ground with the loose weight of someone completely unconscious, with his chest not moving. 911 was called immediately. While waiting, neighbors started CPR. They pressed hard into his sternum, his small frame jerking with each compression. His head rolled slightly with the movement, but there was no sign of any response. Someone tried giving breaths, tilting his head back, sealing their mouth over his, but his chest just didn't rise. When paramedics arrived, they moved quickly. They cut away his shirt to place defibrillator pads on his chest. The skin underneath was pale, cool, and clammy to the touch. The monitor displayed a flat, deorganized line, basically no effective heartbeat. They started bagging him with oxygen, forcing air into his lungs with a mask as compressions continued. The burn marks were clearer under the bright light, tiny coin-sized spots on his arms and one on the side of his neck. They were consistent with electrical contact. Skin was tightly blistered and edged with a faint reddish halo. They lifted him onto a stretcher, still working on him as they moved to the ambulance. His arms dangled off the sides until they were tucked in and strapped down. Inside this vehicle, the narrow space was filled with the sound of the oxygen bag being squeezed, the rhythmic count of compressions, and the shrill beeping of the monitor. At the hospital, the trauma team took over. The bright lights made every detail visible: the burns, the ashen color of his skin, and the slackness of his face. IV lines were inserted, drugs pushed into his veins to try to restart his heart. His body jolted slightly when the defibrillator was used, but his heart rhythm didn't recover. The medical examiner investigation later confirmed the electrocution as the likely cause of his death. The pattern burns were textbook contact points. Internally, there were signs of electrical injury to the muscles and heart tissue, which is why they could never get the heart to start back up again. The path the current had taken, entering through the arms and possibly the side of his neck, then traveling through the torso, had given it a direct route through the heart. And this kind of current can kill in seconds. The parents of Fernando filed a lawsuit in July 2018 against the apartment complex management. They claimed negligence, seeking $1 million in damage. Now, it's not known whether they won or not, but my guess is they probably did, given the circumstances of what happened.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
But that day, none of it mattered. He was just a dad enjoying the beach. While Joshua and Barbara sat in the sand, Owen and his cousin ventured slightly deeper into the water. The ocean didn't look dangerous, and the waves weren't really high, but an invisible rip current had formed. These narrow bands of fast-moving water can appear without warning and pull even strong swimmers away from shore in seconds. The children didn't stand a chance. One moment they were playing, and the next they were being dragged out to sea, with salt water filling their mouths as they kicked and thrashed and tried to scream, but the water just kept coming. Their heads would slip under and then bob back up, with panic settling in instantly. Joshua didn't hesitate. He leapt from the sand and sprinted into the ocean, diving through the surf. The current hit him hard and fast. His legs kicked against it, and his arms fought through every wave. The salt would burn his throat and sting his eyes, but he kept going. He would reach Owen first. The boy was coughing and flailing, and Joshua would pull him up. Then he reached for his niece and managed to grab her too, wrapping one arm around her while keeping Owen in the other. Now he was holding both children, with the current still trying to pull him under. The ocean surged and crashed against his chest and face. Salt water slammed into his nose and mouth, forcing its way down his throat every time he gasped. He tried to turn his body to shield the kids, using himself as a barrier, and his arms shook, but he kept lifting them. Every time they slipped, he grabbed tighter, even as the current dragged all three of them further from land. The physical side of drowning is quite hellish. It begins with water burning your throat and rushing into your mouth. You try to cough, but inhale more. Your body panics, your airways seize shut, and you kick even harder. But the ocean pulls even stronger. Your lungs beg for air you can't get, and you stay awake through all of it, feeling everything. Then your throat finally opens, and water floods into your lungs. Suffocating turns to flooding while your vision fades. Your limbs go numb, and you start to slip away, but not quickly. It's slow, it's violent, and it hurts the entire time. Joshua was enduring all of it, while still holding the kids up. His body was failing, his lungs were filling, and his muscles were obviously burning. But his focus was on keeping them alive. Every wave that slammed into him hit them too, and he absorbed it. He twisted, he kicked, lifted, and pulled. He was dying and still trying to save them. The emotional weight made it even worse. He knew he wasn't going to make it. He even told Owen he was drowning, so he obviously knew that he wasn't gonna make it. He knew that he was about to leave his wife without a husband and his son without a father. He knew his niece would carry the memory of this forever. A nearby man named Lance Jones had seen what was happening and rushed into the water. He reached Joshua and took Owen from his arms. As he did, Owen cried, "My dad said he's drowning." Jones turned back and started to swim the boy toward shore. Another beachgoer reached the niece and helped her in as well. The children were coughing, vomiting seawater, and sobbing when they made it to land, but they survived. Barbara was screaming. She couldn't see Joshua. The crowd on shore scanned the waves, and he was gone. Lifeguards dove into the water and found him face down, unmoving, drifting near the break. When they pulled him in, his skin was pale and cold, his lips purple, and water was still leaking from his mouth and the nose. They rolled him onto his side and began CPR. His chest was compressed with enough force to break his ribs. More water and foam poured out. A second responder gave mouth-to-mouth, forcing in air as his lungs tried to push it back out, with Barbara just standing a few feet away, holding Owen, screaming his name again and again as they worked on him. They didn't stop for over 10 minutes. His body bounced with every compression, his chest rose from rescue breaths, but there was no response. They did load him onto a stretcher soaking wet and limp, with sand stuck in his face and arms, and rushed him to a Baptist medical center. In the ambulance, medics kept going. They inserted their breathing tube, and they gave him injections. His pupils were fixed, and his heart never restarted. At the hospital, trauma doctors tried again. More compressions, more drugs, defibrillator shocks, flatline again, nothing. The doctor eventually checked his pupils one last time and called it. Nurses cleaned his body, peeled away the soaked fabric, and wiped salt water from his skin. His lungs were basically still full of seawater. In the waiting room, Barbara waited for the news she already knew that was coming. A GoFundMe raised thousands to support Barbara and Owen. Strangers wrote things like, "I never knew him, but I'll never forget what he did." News outlets called him a hero, and others called him a father who made the ultimate sacrifice. But to the people who were there was no debate. On a cool, dry afternoon in September 2021, Robert Pratt was working alongside his brother just outside Chinya, Wyoming. The two of them were finishing repairs on a worn-down ATV they'd spent the last couple weeks fixing. They'd replaced the chain, fitted new tires, cleaned the carburetor, and bled the brakes. It was peaceful for him, predictable and controllable. He liked making broken things work again. That day felt like progress. The engine was finally running, the wheels spun smooth, and the brakes responded well in the driveway. The sky was clear with the wind gentle. The worksite sat on open property, bordered by fields that rolled into the Wyoming horizon. Behind the house was an uneven patch of prairie, dips, old fence posts, and a few low hills. It wasn't a trail, but they'd used it before for test rides. The utility poles that ran along the southern stretch had always been there, standing like skeletons against the sky. Robert decided to take the ATV out for a test run, just to see how it would handle under speed. His brother would call after him to be careful. He nodded, already gripping the handlebars, already easing the throttle forward. The engine buzzed louder as he pulled away, kicking up dust. He coasted down the gentle slope behind the property and looped around. Then, as he reached the base of a shallow rise, he accelerated a little too fast. There was a split-second misjudgment. The brakes didn't catch fast enough, maybe the rear tires lost grip in the loose dirt. Whatever the case, the ATV didn't slow down. It rocketed forward, bouncing violently as it hit a hidden rut in the ground. Robert tried to steer, but the machine launched, just briefly before it slammed into a wooden utility pole at full speed. The sound was horrifying. The front of the ATV crumbled on impact. The handlebars snapped inward with bone-crushing force, crushing against Robert's chest before his body was thrown forward. His head struck the top bar with a sickening crack. His body hit the dirt a split second later, rolling once before going still. His brother heard the crash from the yard, and at first he thought maybe the engine had backfired, but when he didn't start it again, a chill ran through him. He jogged down the incline calling Robert's name, and when he spotted the overturned ATV against the pole, his stomach dropped. Robert was lying several feet from the wreck, face down with one leg twisted grotesquely. There was a lot of blood, thick, dark, soaking through his shirt and pooling into the dirt. As Matthew knelt beside him, Robert stirred faintly, letting out a low gurgling moan. Blood was pouring from his mouth and his nose. He rolled onto his side, instinctively coughing, and when he did, a sudden forceful jet of blood sprayed from his mouth like vomit. His lips were literally turning blue. His brother tried to speak to him, voice shaking, but Robert couldn't reply. He blinked disoriented, and his breaths came in panicked, basically wet gasps, each one sounding more like drowning than breathing. Blood streamed down from his nose and filled his throat, bubbling every time he tried to exhale. Matthew had obviously called 911 with trembling fingers, screaming at the dispatcher for help. As he knelt down to Robert, he saw a jagged piece of rib poking under the skin just below the left side of his chest. The shape kind of looked like it was pushing out, as if trying to burst free. Blood kept coming out of his nose, his mouth, and seeping from a tear in his abdomen that soaked the ground. His eyes rolled back slightly with his hands twitching. It took nearly 17 minutes for the ambulance to arrive, but by then Robert was slipping in and out of consciousness. His chest made rattling sounds like something gargling underwater. His body was going cold, and at one point, he gripped Matthew's hands, fingers twitching and weak, with his fingernails dark with blood where he had tried to dig them into the dirt to crawl just after the crash. His shirt had ripped up, revealing massive bruising across his ribs, spreading like a storm cloud down his side and wrapping around his back. His breaths were shallow, erratic, and painful. Every few seconds he tried to breathe in, only to choke on the fluid in his lungs, quite literally drowning from the inside. The EMTs slid a chest tube in to try to relieve the pressure, with blood immediately gushing out in a warm, thick stream that coated the paramedics' hands and soaked through the gauze. They suctioned what they could from his lungs, but the bleeding was so intense that they couldn't clear his airway fast enough. His pulse became barely detectable, and then they raced him to the hospital. Inside the trauma room at this hospital, it only got worse. His spleen was ruptured, liver torn, and the punctured lung had collapsed completely. Several ribs had broken and stabbed inward, with the internal bleeding being so catastrophic every time they tried to transfuse more blood, it leaked into the chest cavity or down his throat. He was going into shock. His oxygen levels were so low his fingertips had already turned purple. The trauma surgeons opened up his chest in a desperate attempt to clamp the bleeding. The surgical team worked for over an hour, cutting, suctioning, clamping, and ventilating. His heart stopped once, they shocked him, he came back, but just barely. Then his pressure dropped again. His stomach was swelling from internal fluid buildup, and his eyes, still open, were fixed and cloudy. The ATV was destroyed, its frame bent like it had been folded in half. There was hair and blood on the left handlebar, and the pole had a deep crack from the force of the collision. The crash site looked like a battlefield. There was no blood, there was no drugs, no alcohol, just a bad angle, loose earth, and a machine that no one had tested at speed. Robert had been wearing a helmet, but it wasn't strapped. It flew off during impact and landed 20 feet away, unscratched. Despite the paramedics' efforts to stabilize him, the trauma team's work at the hospital, the internal damage was just too severe. He had suffered a punctured lung, multiple broken ribs, internal bleeding from a ruptured spleen and lacerated liver, and a collapsed lung that filled rapidly with blood.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
Kathleen Laurel was 83 when her children made the painful decision to move her into a nursing home. She unfortunately had early-stage dementia, arthritis in both knees, and the occasional confusion at night. After visiting several facilities, they chose Willow Ridge Nursing Home in Texas. It seemed like the right fit: clean rooms, a calm atmosphere, and attentive staff. They hoped it would keep her safe. Her daughter Mia visited her every week, and the updates were routine. Kathleen ate her meals, napped regularly, and smiled at nurses. But by the second month, things had shifted. Kathleen had grown quieter. Her hands trembled more, and she scratched at her arms constantly. Mia noticed red marks forming on her mother's forearms and lower legs. When she asked staff about this, they shrugged. Just heat rash, a nurse had said. It happens, we're applying cream and keeping her hydrated. But the next visit brought new injuries, uglier and more concerning. Some marks had turned into deep red bumps, with others oozing. Mia lifted the blanket and found large, scabbed over wounds on her mother's shins. One area on the inner thigh had what looks like a cluster of small puncture wounds. Another had torn open completely, with yellow pus crusting around the edges. Mia's brother Jacob, a former EMT, came the next day. He examined the wounds and immediately said, "This isn't heat rash, these are bites, and repeated ones." Mia began documenting everything: photos, videos, and timestamps. Her mother, barely responsive now, would scratch until she bled, with some areas of skin had been dug into raw flesh. Fingernail trails crisscrossed her thighs and arms, with one particularly disturbing wound on her foot that had a black center, which was necrotic tissue starting to form. They demanded a medical evaluation, but the home delayed. They kept saying there was no emergency and were monitoring her. It took more than 2 days of escalating pressure before an outside doctor was allowed in. And when this physician examined Kathleen, he was horrified. There were over 100 visible bite wounds, many of them clustered in unnatural patterns. The skin around them was inflamed, raised, and discolored, signs of venom reactions and infection. The doctor also noticed something even more disturbing. Embedded in one of the wounds on her ankle were the remains of dead ants. She was then rushed to the hospital that evening, and at the hospital, tests confirmed multiple bacteria infections, some from scratching, others from the bites themselves. Blood work showed elevated white cell blood counts, organ stress, and signs of systemic inflammation. Her body had been in a state of immune overdrive for days. She was running a low-grade fever and had nearly lost 20 pounds in a month, with also having open sores all over her legs and arms. Now, this next detail is quite disturbing. They had found the bites had not all happened at once. Some were recent, and others clearly days old or even weeks old. And there weren't just a few, there were dozens and dozens, many grouped in tight lines or circular swarms. Doctors identified the source: fire ants. They're invasive, aggressive, and lethal in large numbers. Each sting injects venom that burns like acid under the skin. Victims report a sensation like being stabbed with hot needles. The venom causes white, pustules to form, often followed by swelling, blistering, and intense pain. And when swarmed, the body goes into panic, especially if the immune system is weak. Kathleen had been attacked in her sleep. Nurses later admitted she had often been found scratching during night shifts. And one said she once saw ants on Kathleen's blanket but didn't have the time to report a file. The administration claimed they had no reports of insect problems. But when Mia returned to her mother's room after her transfer to the hospital, she found a line of ants marching along the baseboard and onto the edge of the mattress. Tucked behind the leg of a dresser hidden in the dark was a nest. She recorded the video with hundreds of ants crawling in and out of a cracked section of the wood. No poison traps, no tape barriers, nothing had been done. Worse, the sheets were stained with blood and yellow discharge, as if her open wounds had been weeping for days. A pillowcase was streaked with what appeared to be dried vomit. When Mia showed the hospital staff the photos and video, they were stunned. Despite antibiotics and wound care, Kathleen deteriorated rapidly. The infections were just too deep, and her body was too frail as she was a very old woman. She slipped into unconsciousness within 36 hours. The Laurel family filed a lawsuit for gross negligence and wrongful death. They alleged that the staff ignored the signs of infestation, failed to respond to the injuries, and lied to cover their lack of action. The photographic evidence was damning, and state investigators launched a formal inspection of Willow Ridge. And what they found confirmed the worst. Fire ant trails were detected in 3 other patient rooms, including one where the resident was non-verbal and bedridden. The staff had failed to report this activity, and pest control logs were incomplete with no record of any recent treatment. Interviews revealed that staff shortages that often left night shift nurses overwhelmed and unresponsive to complaints. Some aides admitted they were told to downplay injuries as rash to avoid triggering inspections. In the final report, Kathleen's case was listed as one of the worst documented examples of elder care negligence in the state's recent history. Sago, West Virginia is a coal town, like many others in this region. People there rely on mining, not just for jobs, but for survival. It's dangerous work and everyone knows it, still men go underground every day. That's just how life is. On January 2nd, 2006, 13 miners showed up to work the early shift at Sago Mine Number 1. It was the first workday of the new year, with snow covering the hills and temperatures being below zero. The men parked, grabbed their gear, and entered the mine just after 6 a.m. The mine was owned by the International Coal Group, which had reopened the site recently. Many of the miners were experienced and had worked there before. Some were in their 20s, others were older with decades of mining behind them. At 6:26 a.m., just as the men were deep in the tunnels, an explosion rocked the mine. Above-ground lights flickered, and radio contact was dead. Thick black smoke began pouring from the mouth of the mine, and it didn't stop. Emergency calls went out, with rescue crews beginning to assemble. At first, mine supervisors thought it was a transformer or battery malfunction. Then came the gas readings, toxic levels of methane and carbon monoxide. No one could go inside, and it was a full-blown lockdown. Unfortunately, the miners were trapped over 2 miles of underground. Remember, rescuers couldn't enter right away, with the air being deadly. Methane can ignite again with a smaller spark, with carbon monoxide being silent, invisible, and fatal in minutes. So rescue teams had to wait. They had to test and move slowly. This would take over 40 hours to reach the men. In the meantime, the miners' families began arriving. Mothers, wives, and children stood outside the gates, and then moved into the nearby Sago Baptist Church where it was warmer. Church members brought food, blankets, and coffee, with TVs being rolling. Reporters set up cameras and rumors started flying, but official updates were few and vague. Deep in the mine, the trapped men had survived the explosion at least first. They'd moved away from the blast site and barricaded themselves in a sealed section, trying to keep out the poisonous gas. To make this barricade, they used plastic sheeting, duct tape, and roof bolts. Standard procedure in a gas emergency. Behind it, they sat in total darkness with only a few lamps. They turned most of the lights off to conserve the battery, and they took turns breathing from their emergency oxygen packs, which those would only last for about an hour. As time dragged on, they began to suffocate. The carbon monoxide crept in. Now, carbon monoxide, it doesn't just choke like smoke, it replaces oxygen in the blood, slowly shutting down organs while the victim becomes dizzy, then confused. Some of the men would have obviously began to pass out, with others vomiting or began to slur their speeches. They started writing messages to their families. In a small notebook, Martin Toddler Jr., a 51-year-old miner, scribbled a message as his hand shook from oxygen loss. We know this because his handwriting was all over the place, but the note read, "Tell everyone I'll see them on the other side. It wasn't too bad and I just went to sleep. I love you." The handwriting faded near the end, so we don't really know if he said anything else. When rescuers finally reached the barricade on the night of January 3rd, they found the men. They had been behind the plastic sheeting, curled up on the ground side by side. Some were in sitting positions with their heads tilted back, mouths slightly open, while others were laying flat, with their skin pale and eyes being half shut. Most had probably died hours before. They had been breathing air thick with carbon monoxide with no way to escape. The poison had slowly shut down their nervous systems. Their oxygen tanks were empty and lay discarded on the ground. Several had soiled themselves, some had torn off jackets or gloves in the confusion, a known sign of oxygen starvation. Blood pooled in their extremities and early stages of rigor mortis. Their fingernails were dark purple and in some cases foam had leaked from their mouths, a common sign of gas inhalation. A few had scratches on their arms and faces, likely from disorientation in the pitch black. One man had clawed at the wall near the barricade, leaving blood smears behind. Only one man survived, Randall McCloy Jr., a 26-year-old. He was unconscious when found, barely being alive. He had severe carbon monoxide poisoning, brain swelling, collapsed lungs, and damage to his liver and his kidneys. His core temperature was barely 90 degrees Fahrenheit. He had been breathing toxic gas for nearly 2 days, which is honestly remarkable how he was able to stay alive for that long. McCloy was rushed to a hospital and placed in a medically induced coma. Doctors didn't expect him to live, but slowly over the following weeks, he regained consciousness. The world outside the mine, meanwhile, had been told the opposite. Due to a communication error, officials on the surface initially announced that 12 miners had been found alive. This news reached the families first, and the Sago Baptist Church, where people screamed, cried, and celebrated. Bells were rung, and calls were made to relatives across the country. Even the governor gave a live statement declaring the survival of nearly all the men, but this was all false. About 3 hours later, officials walked into the church and announced the truth. Only one man had been found alive, and the rest were gone. The rage and grief that followed were overwhelming. Some family members screamed at the company officials, with others collapsing. Several had to be taken away by ambulance due to shock and blood pressure strikes. One woman fainted and struck her head. McCloy later said the men had did everything they could. They tried to stay calm, they rationed air, and they waited for help that never came. Investigations later revealed that the mine had a long history of safety violations, including over 200 citations in the previous year alone. Some were directly related to ventilation and methane accumulation. Despite this, it was kept open. The explosion was blamed on a spark that ignited a pocket of methane, most likely caused by a lightning strike that entered the main's cable system. The Mine Safety and Health Administration faced scrutiny for weak enforcement and lack of follow-ups. The ICG, the company that operated the mine, was heavily criticized for poor emergency preparation and slow response times. They paid fines but admitted no wrongdoing, which is absolutely crazy. The federal government responded with the Manure Act of 2006, which required underground tracking systems, more emergency air packs, and faster communication protocols. 12 funerals were held over the next week, with most miners were buried in closed caskets. Families requested autopsy reports, with some receiving photos of their loved ones' final resting positions. One man was found clutching a rosary, another was laying next to a note addressed to his daughter, folded and tucked into his pocket. After all of this, the Sago mine was permanently closed.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
On April 29, 2025, just outside Brewton, Minnesota, the weather was clear, dry, and perfect for fieldwork. On a farm along Country Road 201 in North Fork Township, a man named Eric Scoot Sager was planting corn. He was using a John Deere DB66 corn planter, basically a wide, heavy, hydraulic-powered machine designed to fold inward for road travel. After finishing a section of the field, Eric stopped to fold the planter so it could be moved to the next plot. But something wasn't working. One of the folding wings wasn't rising properly. Hydraulic systems like this use high-pressure fluid to raise and hold enormous steel arms weighing about a few thousand pounds. And if anything goes wrong, like a leak, a blocked valve, a kinked line, the arm will not move. So the safest thing to do in this situation is to shut down everything and inspect it, and that's what Eric did. He crouched down beneath the towering frame of the planter to check for leaks or damage. The wing's arms, still elevated, loomed directly above him. The system was holding and there was no noise or no warning. Not a single hiss or groan, just the hum of wind through the tiled rows. And then, without a sound, it fell. The left wing, several tons of solid steel, would collapse straight down. In less than a second, it landed directly across Eric's chest and abdomen. The crushing force was absolute. There was no give, no delay, or no struggle. Just an impact like a car crash delivered by gravity in steel. The machine didn't bounce or stop halfway, it just simply settled on top of him and stayed there. His chest caved in instantly, his ribs cracked and snapped inward like dry sticks, with his sternum splintered. The force crushed his lungs flat and compressed his diaphragm so violently that the air shot out of his mouth in a final, involuntary exhale. His spine compressed with a sharp crack, and internally, the trauma was catastrophic. His liver was torn, his intestines burst in several places, and major blood vessels would rupture. His stomach, pancreas, and kidneys were flattened beneath the planter and the earth beneath him. But he was still alive. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face was twisted with blood rising in his throat. His hands spasmed, his legs twitched against the ground with the sheer pressure from the machine, paralyzing him and would seal off most external bleeding. The weight of the machine created a horrifying effect. It crushed him so thoroughly that the massive bleeding stayed contained within his torso, trapped in a body that was now essentially shut off by the steel. His coworker, who had been standing nearby, stood frozen for a second, then bolted toward the machine. He yelled Eric's name, no response, and then he grabbed his phone and dialed 911, yelling into the speaker that the planter had fallen on someone. Then, the dispatcher sent emergency services from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office, the Bruton Fire Department, and a LifeLink Air ambulance. It was about 5:47 p.m. when that call came through. As Eric lay trapped, his body continued to betray him. Blood pooled in his abdomen cavity, and the vessels that weren't already ruptured began to tear under the rising internal pressure. The weight of this machine had turned his circulatory system into a sealed bomb, one that hadn't exploded yet, but would. His lungs, already collapsed, began filling with blood. His eyes rose slightly, and the vessels in his face began to burst, creating purple bruising and red speckling across his eyes and cheeks. When responders would eventually arrive, minutes later, they found Eric completely pinned. He wasn't speaking and his body was slightly convulsing. He was still conscious, and because of that, they acted fast, deploying hydraulic jacks and stabilizing equipment to lift the planter. They wedged blocks underneath, adjusted the position, and slowly raised the steel wing off his body. As soon as this pressure lifted, everything would go wrong. What had been holding his body together was now gone, and instantly the ruptured vessels let loose. Blood flooded his chest. The damaged organs, now able to expand again, began to fail in rapid succession. His heart, no longer compressed, started beating erratically, trying to compensate. But the blood loss was massive. Several liters spilled into his torso in seconds. His lungs tried to reinflate, but one had been torn open and air hissed out with a wet bubbling sound. Paramedics placed him on the ground and began CPR. They attempted to ventilate him, but blood poured from his mouth. His eyes were wide but unresponsive. One EMT placed pads on his chest and shocked him. Nothing. Another tried to find a pulse in his neck, but it was gone. His skin was molted, already turning gray-blue. His chest cavity had collapsed inward. His abdomen was described gelatinous to the touch, from the organs having been liquefied from the downward pressure. One responder described it as a bag of bones floating in soup. Despite their efforts, Eric was pronounced dead at the scene. It took less than 5 minutes from the moment the machine collapsed to the moment his heart stopped. 5 minutes of brutal, silent suffering. He couldn't cry out, he couldn't even move, he couldn't escape, and he was awake, aware, and being crushed alive by a machine he had trusted. It was quick but not instant, painful but quiet. A kill by pressure, silence, and weight. No foul play was suspected, and the machinery had not been locked out. No support blocks were in place, and the hydraulic system failed. And the planter did exactly what every piece of heavy equipment does when it loses pressure. It dropped, and it would drop on Eric Scott Seagar. At 6:57 a.m. on January 14, 2019, a neighbor stepped outside their home on Maple Street in Newport, New Hampshire. The temperature was -8 Fahrenheit, with snow hardened into packed ice, and the sky was beginning to lighten, but the sun hadn't fully risen. The street was silent as the neighbors stepped onto their porch. As they did this, they noticed something across the street. On the front steps of another small house, a small, unmoving shape. It was like a bundle of clothes at first, something someone might have left out overnight. But it didn't shift in the wind or look like a pile of fabric. Curious and confused, the neighbor walked closer, discovering it was a child. She was lying sideways on the steps, curled slightly as if asleep. She had no coat, no shoes, and thin pajamas clung to her small frame, stiff from the cold. Her feet were bare, stuck to the ice-covered concrete. Her lips were nearly black, her fingers were curled into frozen claws, and her skin was pale, bluish-gray with patches of frost along her cheeks. Her mouth was partially open, and her hair had frozen solid against the step. She wasn't breathing, her limbs were stiff, and her face rigid. The neighbor immediately called 911, and emergency services responded within minutes. Police, firefighters, and paramedics would arrive, and they pulled her body from the step where it had partially frozen. Paramedics tried to resuscitate her. They wrapped her in warming blankets, attempted CPR, pumped oxygen, and checked for any sign of a pulse. But not surprising, there was nothing. Her core body temperature was too low to register. She was transported to the hospital where they attempted to revive her again, but she was declared dead shortly after. Her name was Sophia Van Schalk, and she was only 2.5 years old. But before all this, Sophia had just moved into the Maple Street home with her mother and siblings. The house was old, the kind with worn fixtures and aging doors. The front door had a basic knob and a latch mechanism, but no deadbolt or child-proof lock. What no one realized until it was too late, that the latch often failed to engage unless someone pulled the door tightly and manually locked it. If left unchecked, the door would appear shut, but could easily swing open from the inside. That night, Sophia went to bed like any other. She wore footless cotton pajamas, and her mother said goodnight, tucked her in, and later went to sleep herself. The heating was on and the other children were asleep, so everything seemed normal. But at some point between 3:30 and 4 a.m., Sophia had gotten out of bed and wandered to the front door. Why she did so remains unknown. Maybe she was confused after the recent move, or maybe she was looking for a parent. But when she pushed the door, it opened. The cold hit her instantly. Wind tore through the doorway and Sophia stepped onto the porch in just her pajamas. The door swung shut behind her, and because of the faulty latch, it sealed from the outside, so she couldn't open it again, meaning she was basically locked out. Within minutes, her small body began to shut down. Skin freezes quickly at -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Her fingers and toes would have gone numb and then stiff. Her ears and cheeks began to frost, and she may have knocked out, or she may have cried. Something that actually supports this is a neighbor reported hearing what sounded like a child crying faintly around 4 a.m. But no one went to check, and the sound didn't actually last for a while, so they probably just forgot about it. Sophia eventually sat or collapsed on the steps. Her body, now failing to shiver, was entering the final stages of hypothermia. Her lips darkened, her skin turned gray-blue, and her hair froze against the cement. Her feet froze in place, her breathing slowed, and her limbs stiffened. Her hands curled in on themselves like frozen claws. Her last breath likely escaped without a sound. When she was found hours later, her body was so cold that paramedics couldn't get a temperature reading. Basically, she had frozen in place. Her body had to be pulled from the concrete. The damage was so severe her hair tore as it was unstuck from the step. Now, I'm going to say what most of you are thinking. Why would a 2.5-year-old kid decide to get out of her bed and then walk towards the front door, and then walk out of it? Out of all places in this house? Well, I don't know, nor does the police know. The police first thought the woman was lying because why wouldn't she at least check the front door to make sure it was locked, as she had been living in the house for a couple of days, and it just didn't make sense for the kid just to walk out the door. But there was no history of any type of abuse in this house, and the mother really did look like she was distraught, and there was really no hard evidence of her doing anything. Another possibility, at least I was thinking, was since the door wasn't fully latched, walked in, grabbed the girl, and put her out there. But no, as the door couldn't be pushed from the outside, only from the inside. Also, there was no forced entries, nothing like that in the house. So to this day, we really don't know what made Sophia walk out of her house in the middle of the night and into the cold, leading to her death. It was July 6, 2003. The Santa Monica Farmers Market on Arizona Avenue had been operating since morning, with vendors lining both sides of the street between 4th and 2nd. The market, held weekly, attracted thousands of shoppers. Dozens of tents covered the sidewalks and asphalt. Shoppers browsed in close quarters, families with children, elderly couples walking slowly, and people carrying fresh produce and flowers in canvas bags. The street had been officially closed to vehicle traffic for the market. Traffic barriers, signs, and cones were placed at each entrance. Around 1:45 p.m., a silver 1992 Buick approached from the east, driven by George Russell Weller, age 86. Weller's driving record included only minor infractions. He was alone, and his car moved through the intersection of 4th and Arizona with no indication of stopping. Witnesses said he appeared calm, looking forward. The vehicle bypassed the barriers, entering the restricted pedestrian zone without slowing. The car struck the first people within seconds of entering the market. There was no honking, no braking, and the vehicle accelerated. Witnesses recalled a sudden, violent sound as metal slamming into flesh, bodies thudding against the hood. One man was hit head-on and thrown 20 feet, landing on his neck. A woman carrying a toddler was struck mid-stride. Her body was lifted onto the windshield while the child flew from her arms and hit the pavement head first. The car rolled over a man pushing a cart, crushing his chest with his ribs broken inward and puncturing his lungs. The Buick would continue forward, moving through the crowd at 50 to 60 miles per hour. People would obviously scream and scatter. Some were dragged under the wheels, and others were thrown aside like loose mannequins. Vendor tables shattered on impact, and wooden crates exploded under the car. One elderly woman was hit, flipped over the hood, then slammed onto the street as the car kept going, with her skull cracking open on the asphalt. A man walking beside her tried to grab her arm in time, but he was caught by the bumper and pulled underneath. Fruits, vegetables, and human remains mixed into the street. Blood streaked in long lines behind the tires. A woman crouching next to her stall was hit directly in the back. Her spine fractured and she was thrown against a tin pole. One child was hit and crushed entirely under the front wheel. His body was later found nearly severed at the torso. One leg had detached entirely and was located several feet away. The car traveled through nearly 2.5 blocks of the market before finally coming to a stop near 2nd Street. But behind him, the street was littered with debris, splintered wood, scattered produce, overturned strollers, shoes without owners, purses, blood, and pieces of clothing. Bystanders would naturally scream and sob. Some attempted resuscitation on the victims, pressing on collapsed chests and performing CPR through broken jaws and gurgling wounds. Others stood in shock, their faces and clothes splattered with blood. One vendor described hearing a cracking sound and turning to see someone's arm folding completely backward. Emergency services were dispatched immediately. Police and firefighters arrived within minutes and began to help. 9 people had suffered fatal injuries. Dozens more were scattered across the street, moving or unconscious, bleeding from open fractures or deep abdominal lacerations. Some had compound fractures with bones protruding through the skin. Several people were pinned beneath vendor structures, with one woman, having been said earlier, had been thrown into a metal pole, being impaled through her lower chest. A 3-year-old boy was found face down near the curb. He had been struck earlier in the vehicle's path. A medical examiner later confirmed his neck had been broken on impact. His mother was also struck and died at the scene. Paramedics attempted to stabilize some of the victims, but many had suffered trauma incompatible with life. Crushed skulls, multiple organ ruptures, or internal decapitation. George Weller remained in the driver's seat when officers reached the car. He was conscious and did not appear physically injured. When questioned, he stated he had confused the accelerator with the brake. He told officers that he couldn't stop, but he was removed from the vehicle and taken into custody. The car was impounded and examined by forensic investigators, but no surprise, no mechanical failures were ever found. The accelerator, brake system, and steering were fully functional. The tires bore streaks of blood and fabric. Pieces of clothing and tissue were lodged under the chassis. Impact marks and blood splattered on the windshield and hood matched the trajectory of the bodies. The investigation confirmed that the car had entered the pedestrian area and traveled 1,000 feet, hitting at least 63 people, with 9 being killed. Their injuries included full-body crush trauma, open skull fractures, massive internal bleeding, and decapitation by impact. Among the dead were a toddler, several elderly victims, and multiple market regulars. Over 50 people were injured, some critically. Many required surgeries, amputations, or long physical therapy, with several survivors sustaining permanent brain damage. In 2004, Weller was charged with 9 counts, vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence. At his 2006 trial, prosecutors argued that he had multiple opportunities to stop the car, which he obviously did. Expert witnesses testified that his foot had remained on the accelerator the entire time. Weller actually never applied the brakes. His path through the market had been straight and deliberate, without any indication of distress or loss of consciousness. He had driven directly over victims without attempting to swerve or avoid them. He did not testify at the trial, and the jury was shown autopsy photos, surveillance videos, and statements from victims' families. One mother described her daughter get thrown into a table like a rag doll. Another man recalled the wet snapping sound as someone's body was crushed behind them. Medical examiners testified to the scale of destruction to the human bodies, describing organs quote-unquote displaced completely from the cavity and bones reduced to gravel-like fragments. Not surprising, Weller was convicted on all accounts. However, due to his age and medical condition, he was sentenced to probation and house arrest. He actually never served any jail time. In the aftermath, city officials made changes to the market's layout, heavy concrete barriers were installed, and traffic protocols were revised. Memorial plaques were placed at the site, and a yearly moment of silence was held for the victims. The incident remains one of the most catastrophic pedestrian fatalities in modern US history, not caused by terrorism or quote-unquote intentional violence.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.
On June 28, 2008, 17-year-old Asia LeSean Ferguson IV arrived at Six Flags Over Georgia with a church group from Okie Spring Baptist Church in Springfield, South Carolina. The group had traveled together for a summer outing, looking forward to a day of thrilling rides, games, and fellowship at one of the most popular amusement parks in the region. Asia had a passion for sports and adventure, and like many others in his group, he was excited to experience the park's biggest attractions. Six Flags Over Georgia featured some of the most intense roller coasters in the state, including Goliath, Superman Ultimate Fight, and Batman: The Ride. At some point during the afternoon, Asia and another teenager separated from the main group, making their way toward Batman: The Ride. This inverted roller coaster had been a major attraction at the park since its opening in 1997. Designed to give riders the sensation of flying through Gotham City, the ride featured sharp turns, loops, and high speeds, with riders' legs dangling freely beneath the track. Batman: The Ride reached speeds of up to 50 miles per hour, covering 2,693 feet of track. It was known for its intense G-forces, with sections of the ride coming dangerously close to the ground. For safety reasons, a restricted zone was built beneath the ride, ensuring that no one could accidentally wander into its path. The area was surrounded by two separate fences, each standing 6 feet tall, with clear warning signs stating "Do not enter" and "Authorized personnel only." These barriers were in place to prevent guests from entering an area where trains zoomed past at extreme speeds. Despite these safety measures, Asia and his companion somehow entered the restricted area. To do so, they had to scale both fences, ignoring the warning signs posted on them. Some early reports suggested that Asia might have been retrieving a lost hat, as similar incidents had happened at other amusement parks. However, authorities later ruled out the hat retrieval theory, stating there was no evidence he had lost anything. Once inside, Asia and the other teenager were directly beneath the track of the coaster, in an area where ride operators and park employees could not see them. Batman: The Ride was operational at the time, running as usual. The coaster was designed to stay low to the ground in certain sections, with support beams and steel track structures surrounding the area. Asia had no warning as the train approached at full speed. He was likely unaware of the exact path the coaster took. At approximately 2 p.m., as the train came barreling through one of its loops at 50 miles per hour, Asia was struck with full force. The impact was catastrophic. The coaster's ride felt a sudden, violent jolt, but at high speeds, many were unaware of what had happened. Nearby witnesses saw the horrific accident unfold. Among them was an off-duty police officer from Georgia who immediately alerted the park security and called for help. Park security and emergency medical personnel rushed to the scene, but there was nothing that they could do. Asia had been killed instantly on impact. His body was recovered from the restricted area, and the ride was immediately shut down as authorities began an investigation. Asia's family, who were present at the park that day, were notified of his death. They were devastated, struggling to comprehend how their joyful summer trip had ended in an unimaginable tragedy. His father, Asia LeSean Ferguson III, later described his son as a bright, outgoing young man who was always smiling and full of energy. Following the incident, the park launched a formal investigation to determine how and why Asia had been able to access the restricted area. Authorities confirmed that all safety measures were in place. The fences were secure, the warning signs were clearly visible, and there was no evidence of park negligence. The investigation concluded that Asia had entered the restricted area voluntarily, though his exact reasoning remains unknown. Six Flags Over Georgia temporarily closed Batman the ride after the incident. The Georgia Department of Labor, responsible for overseeing amusement park safety, conducted a full inspection before allowing the ride to reopen. Their findings confirmed that the ride had been operating as designed and that the accident resulted from unauthorized entry into a restricted zone, not a mechanical failure. On the night of August 4th, 2013, in Campbellton, New Brunswick, Canada, two young brothers, Noah and Connor Barth, were having a sleepover at their best friend's home. Noah was 6 years old and Connor was 4. The boys had spent the entire day playing outside, enjoying what should have been an ordinary summer evening. They had been at the home of Jean-Claude Sauvois, the father of their friend, who lived in an apartment above his exotic pet store, Reptile Ocean. The boys loved animals. They had visited this home many times before and were no strangers to the exotic creatures inside the store below. They even helped feed a small group of farm animals that Sauvois kept in a pen behind the building. The day had been long, filled with excitement, and by the time night fell, the two brothers were exhausted. A mattress had been placed on the living room floor for them, and they quickly fell asleep. But while they slept, something was moving above them, something they could not see, something that should have never been loose. Sauvois had lived in this apartment for years. Among the many reptiles he kept in his store, he had a single, particularly large and dangerous snake inside his home. An African rock python measuring 14 feet or 4.3 meters and weighing nearly 100 pounds or 45 kilograms. The python had been in his care for over a decade. African rock pythons are among the largest snakes in the world. They are powerful constrictors with a reputation for aggression. Unlike common pet constrictors like ball pythons or boa constrictors, African rock pythons are unpredictable and extremely strong. The snake was kept in a large glass enclosure in Sauvois' apartment, separate from the reptiles in the store. Above the enclosure was a ventilation duct that connected to the apartment's ceiling. At some point before the kids went to sleep, a metal vent cover had been removed for maintenance but was never properly secured again. The cover had fallen onto the floor multiple times, yet Sauvois had assumed the snake was too large to escape through the opening. But sometime during the night, the python did something unexpected. Driven by curiosity, or perhaps by the lingering scent of the animals the boys had fed earlier that day, it forced its way into the open ventilation duct. Once inside, it slithered through the ceiling, directly above the room where Noah and Connor lay sleeping. As it moved, the snake's massive body caused the ceiling tiles to weaken under its weight. For minutes, possibly even hours, it moved unseen, gliding above the sleeping boys in near silence. Then, without warning, a section of the ceiling collapsed. The python plummeted from the darkness above, landing directly into the living room. The sudden impact likely jolted the boys awake, but before they could react, the snake instinctively coiled around them. African rock pythons kill by constriction, wrapping their bodies tightly around their prey and tightening their grip with every exhale. Each time the victim breathes out, the snake's coils grow tighter, preventing them from drawing in another breath. Struggling only makes the constriction worse. There were no screams. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the horrifying evidence that would be found the next morning. The snake's powerful muscles compressed, squeezing the life from their small bodies within minutes. Unlike some constrictors, which may release their grip once their prey is unconscious, African rock pythons continue constricting until all movement has stopped. By the time Sauveur entered the living room the next morning, the boys were unresponsive. The massive snake was still in the room, stretched out on or near the bodies of Noah and Connor. The horrifying realization hit immediately. Authorities were called and paramedics quickly arrived, but there was nothing they could do. The boys had already succumbed to asphyxiation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an immediate investigation. Reptile Ocean was shut down, and all the animals inside were seized. The python was captured and later euthanized. As news of the tragedy spread, it sparked shock and outrage. How had a dangerous 100-pound predator been allowed to live in a home where children were present? Why hadn't the open ventilation duct been secured long before the incident? Sauveur was later charged with criminal negligence causing death. The prosecutors argued that he had failed to properly secure the snake's enclosure, despite knowing about the ventilation duct being open. During the trial, it was revealed that the vent cover had been on the floor multiple times, yet Sauveur never fixed it. The defense, however, claimed that he had no reason to believe the python would escape in such a way. The snake had been in his care for years and never had attempted to leave its enclosure before. The jury deliberated, and in November 2016, he was found not guilty. The court ruled that while the event was tragic, there was not enough evidence to prove criminal negligence beyond a reasonable doubt. The ultimate truth is simple yet devastating. A single mistake, the vent being left unsecure, costed 2 innocent children their lives. Eliezer Torres Gomez arrived for his shift at the Cintas Industrial Laundry Facility in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the morning. The air inside the plant was thick, with steam and the smell of detergent, the rhythmic sounds of conveyor belts, and industrial dryers filling the massive space. At some point during his shift, Torres noticed a jam on one of the conveyor belts, leading to a dryer. Conveyor jams weren't uncommon. Sometimes clothes bunched together, causing blockages that disrupted the flow of operations. Workers were expected to clear these jams quickly to prevent any delays. According to company policy, anytime maintenance was performed on a conveyor, the machine was supposed to be shut down first. This was a critical safety measure designed to prevent accidents. But for reasons unknown, Torres climbed onto the moving conveyor belt without stopping the machine. Perhaps he thought it would be a simple fix. Maybe he was under pressure to keep the line moving, but within seconds, his uniform was caught in the machinery. The belt pulled him forward with relentless force, dragging him toward the gaping mouth of the industrial dryer ahead. He fought to pull himself free, struggling against the crushing grip of the machine, but the conveyor did not stop. No one saw what was happening in time to intervene. The belt fed him directly into the dryer's chamber, and the heavy door slammed shut behind him, locking automatically. The cycle began immediately. The dryer was designed to tumble its contents for 20 minutes, ensuring that every piece of fabric inside was evenly heated and dried. The machine's drum rotated constantly, slamming its contents against its steel walls as the temperature began to rise. The air inside quickly became unbearably hot, climbing past 200 degrees Fahrenheit in minutes. Trapped in the pitch-black interior, Torres was thrown against the scalding metal, his body flipping and rolling with each rotation. His skin began to burn on contact with the heated surface, blisters forming almost instantly before being torn away as he was thrown into another part of the drum. The moisture from the wet uniforms surrounding him turned into searing steam, filling the small chamber with boiling humidity. The constant motion fractured his ribs, dislocated his joints, and shattered the smaller bones in his hands and fingers as he instinctively tried to brace himself against the rotating walls. His clothing soaked at first, quickly dried, and then ignited in places where it made direct contact with the hottest surfaces, fusing to his skin. After 10 minutes, his body was in shock. Dehydration set in as he lost his fluids rapidly through his burns. His nervous system, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of pain, began to shut down. As he struggled to breathe, his throat swollen nearly shut from the exposure to the scorching air. What makes this even more worse, he was still conscious for most of this time, his body fighting, desperate for survival, but there was no escape. Every attempt to move only resulted in more searing pain, more broken bones, and more of his skin being stripped away with each collision. At the 15-minute mark, his body had been brutalized beyond recognition. His skin, once blistered, was now charred in some places and completely torn away in others, revealing cooked muscles underneath. His lungs were failing, starved of oxygen, his body shutting down organ by organ. His nerve endings had been destroyed and the most exposed areas, meaning that by the final minutes, he may have not been able to feel the worst of what was happening to him. Although his body was a ruined mass of burned, broken tissue, and his mind likely drifted into unconsciousness as his pulse slowed. When the dryer finally stopped and the door unlatched automatically, his body was barely recognizable as a human. A worker arrived to unload the freshly dried uniforms, opening the machine as he had done countless times before. The sight inside made him freeze. There, among the clothing, what was remained of Torres Gomez. His body was twisted and contorted from the constant tumbling, his skin blackened and peeling, fused in places with the melted fabric of his uniform. His face was unrecognizable, his hands locked in a final futile attempt to shield himself. The worker who discovered him staggered back, unable to process what he was looking at. Chaos erupted in the facility. Some workers screamed, others stood in silent horror, unable to look away. Managers scrambled to contain the situation, but there was nothing they could do. The authorities arrived quickly, and soon OSHA launched an investigation into what had gone wrong. Their findings were damning. Cintas had a long history of safety violations across multiple locations. Lockout-tagout procedures, which were supposed to ensure the machinery was turned off before maintenance, were not being followed properly. Workers had never been given adequate training to prevent such an incident, and the facility lacked the necessary safeguards that could have stopped the machine in time. Cintas was fined $2.7 million, one of the largest penalties ever issued in an industrial accident case. The company initially tried to shift blame onto Torres Gomez, claiming he had failed to follow safety protocols, but the truth was undeniable. This was not a freak accident, it was the direct result of negligence. His widow sued the company, reaching a settlement for an undisclosed amount, but my guess, it was a lot. But no amount of money could undo what had happened. The changes that followed were too late. For Torres Gomez, new safety measures were implemented, emergency shutoff switches were installed, and workers were given more training. But none of that erased the fact that he had been burned alive inside a machine that should have never been running when he climbed onto that conveyor. In the spring of 1986, Vancouver was abuzz with excitement as it hosted Expo 86, a world's fair celebrating transportation and communication. Families from across Canada and beyond flocked to the city to partake in the festivities, eager to explore all the exhibits. Among these visitors were the Ford family from Nanaimo, British Columbia. The parents were Francis and Kathleen, accompanied by their 9-year-old daughter, Karen. Karen was a spirited child. The prospect of attending Expo 86 had filled her with anticipation for months. On May 9th, 1986, the Ford family arrived at the bustling expo grounds. The air was filled with sounds of laughter, music, and the hum of conversations in various languages. Navigating through the crowds, the family made their way to the Canada Pavilion, an architectural marvel designed to resemble a sleek, luxury liner with towering sails. Inside, the pavilion offered a journey through Canada's past, present, and envisioned future, featuring exhibits that highlighted the nation's achievements and aspirations. One of the main attractions was a unique theater setup, 2 semi-circular theaters connected by a revolving turntable. This design allowed visitors to experience multiple presentations seamlessly. As they entered the first theater, the Fords joined other attendees, leaning on padded supports designed for comfort during the show. The lights dimmed and a film showcasing Canada's natural beauty and cultural diversity began. Karen was entranced, her eyes reflecting the vivid images on the screen. Upon the film's conclusion, an announcement informed the audience that the floor would rotate, positioning them for the next presentation in the adjoining theater. The turntable mechanism activated and the platform began its smooth rotation. Unbeknownst to the Fords, the design included a moving wall and an overhead beam, part of the theater's structure. As the platform shifted, the moving wall and the beam formed a closing gap, creating a hazardous space between them. In her eagerness to catch a glimpse of the upcoming exhibit, Karen stepped slightly away from her parents, positioning herself near the edge of the turntable. The ambient noise of the pavilion masked the subtle sounds of the machinery in motion. As the gap between the moving wall and the overhead beam narrowed, Karen unknowingly found herself in a dangerous position. In a tragic instant, she became trapped between the moving wall and the beam. The machinery, oblivious to the obstruction, continued its programmed movement. Panic erupted as nearby visitors realized the danger, their shouts piercing the air. Francis and Kathleen, horrified, reached out in vain to pull their daughter to safety. The mechanical forces at play were relentless, and Karen was subjected to immense pressure. Expo staff quickly halted the mechanism, but the damage had been done. Medical personnel arrived promptly, but it was evident that Karen had sustained fatal injuries. The force of the compression caused her death almost immediately. The pavilion was evacuated and Expo officials launched an immediate investigation into the incident. The attraction was closed indefinitely and safety protocols across the Expo were reevaluated to prevent such a tragedy from ever recurring. The Ford family, devastated by their loss of their beloved daughter, sought solace away from the public eye, grappling with the profound void left in Karen's absence. In the aftermath, a coroner's inquest was convened to examine the circumstances surrounding the accident. The jury's findings highlighted flaws in the pavilion's safety measures, noting that the design did not adequately account for the possibility of a person being caught between the moving and stationary parts of the theater. It was determined that additional safety measures, such as automatic shutoff mechanisms and staff monitoring, should have been in place to prevent such an accident. On September 1st, 1988, Kelly Bruce Bethard and a friend set out on a trip to the old Amethyst mine in the Four Peaks region of Arizona. The mine, known for its deposits of high-quality amethyst, was a remote and difficult place to access. Independent miners often work in these conditions, hoping to uncover valuable gemstones. Kelly was only 19 years old, had a young family. His wife, Brenna, was pregnant with their second child, and they already had a 1-year-old daughter, Amanda Leigh. The trip to the mine was not an easy one. The terrain was rough, and the hike required careful navigation through steep and uneven ground. After arriving, Kelly and his friend spent some time looking for a good spot to dig. Eventually, Kelly found an area that seemed promising. It was underneath a massive boulder, estimated to weigh about 5 tons. The ground beneath the boulder was damp from recent weather, but that didn't deter him. Confident in his ability to extract something valuable, he lay down and began digging. For some time, everything seemed normal. The two men worked steadily, chipping away at the earth. The mine was quiet, except for the sounds of tools hitting the rock and the occasional conversation between the friends. They weren't in a rush. Mining in a place like this required patience. As Kelly continued to dig, the stability of the ground beneath the boulder was slowly changing. The combination of his movements and the damp soil had begun to shift the foundation supporting the massive rock. Without warning, the boulder gave away. In an instant, it rolled, shifting just enough to trap Kelly beneath its crushing weight. The left side of his body was pinned down, completely immobilized. He immediately realized the severity of the situation and began frantically trying to pull himself free, but it was impossible. His friend, in shock at what had just happened, rushed to help. He tried everything he could with his bare hands, digging desperately at the ground, pushing against the boulder, looking for any way to free Kelly, but the weight was too much. There was no way to move it without proper equipment. For the next hour, Kelly remained trapped. He was fully conscious, aware of his situation, and struggling to stay calm. He talked to his friend, his voice shifting between pain, fear, and frustration. The reality of the situation was setting in. His breathing became more labored, and his words less frequent. His friend continued to stay with him, offering reassurance, but as time passed, Kelly's responses grew weaker. Then, at some point, the mine fell silent. His friend called out to him, but there was no response. He waited, hoping to hear something, anything, but Kelly had stopped talking. That was the moment he knew he had to get help. What's interesting to note, instead of heading to the nearest police station, he made the decision to drive home, Tempe, Arizona, where Kelly's family lived. The journey took nearly 2 hours. When he arrived, he told them what had happened. Kelly's parents and sister were devastated, but the most immediate concern was getting rescue efforts underway. However, the authorities did not act quickly. Despite the urgency, it took several days before the police agreed to begin a recovery mission. By then, everyone knew that there was no longer a question of rescue. It was a matter of retrieving Kelly's body. When they finally arrived at the mine, there was nothing to be done. Kelly had died within an hour of being crushed by the boulder. He had been left trapped in pain, knowing there was no way out. His young wife, who had been expecting their second child, was left to raise their children without him. The impact of his death was devastating. His family had to process the tragic and preventable loss of a husband, son, and father. But Kelly's death did not only affect them. His friend, the one who had been there with him, who had tried and failed to save him, who had to leave him behind, carried the weight of that day for the rest of his life. A few years later, that same friend deleted himself. While no one could say without absolute certainty why, those who knew him believed it was because of survivor's guilt. He had been the last person to see Kelly alive, to hear his voice fade away, to feel helplessly as his friend slowly lost his life beneath that boulder. Kelly Bruce Bethard died at 19 years old, trapped and alone in the Four Peaks mine, leaving behind a family that would never be the same. On March 20th, 2019, in Waterloo Township, Michigan, 63-year-old Rex Harold Houndwood was tending to farm work, as he had done for decades. A lifelong farmer, Rex and his wife, Judy, ran Houndwood Lamb Farms, supplying local markets with their products. That day, one of his tasks involved working with a manure spreader. This machine used a powerful rotating auger, a massive, spiral-shaped screw, to break apart and distribute manure across the fields. Augers are standard farming equipment, but they are also some of the most dangerous, with high-speed rotating parts that can pull in anything that gets too close. At around 12:40 p.m., Rex noticed that something wasn't working properly. The auger had either jammed or wasn't functioning as expected. These types of mechanical issues were common on farms, and Rex, having spent years working with similar equipment, likely thought it would be a quick fix. He approached the auger, possibly reaching in with a tool or his hand to clear a blockage or inspect the mechanism. At some point, his clothing, most likely the sleeve of his jacket or a loose pant leg, got caught in the rotating screw. In an instant, the fabric tightened, yanking him forward with immense force. The auger worked quickly, pulling his arm into the machine before he could react. The spiraling motion twisted his limb, breaking bones instantly as the force of the rotating metal crushed and tore through his skin. His shoulder was next, dislocating and fracturing as the relentless metal continued its rotation. The pain would have been immediate and overwhelming, but his ordeal was far from over. Pinned and hopeless, Rex struggled to pull himself free, but the auger continued to drag him in deeper. The pressure built up, snapping ribs as his torso was forced into the machine. His breathing would have become shallow as his chest was compressed, his lungs struggling against the crushing weight. His internal organs were likely ruptured, causing severe internal bleeding. The lower half of his body remained outside the machine, but he had no way of freeing himself. The sheer force of the machinery would have made it impossible for him to move. Blood loss would have been rapid, and his body likely went into shock within moments. He may have attempted to call for help, but the farm was remote, and no one was close enough to hear him. For nearly an hour, Rex remained trapped, his body broken and unable to escape. As his injuries worsened, his pulse weakened. He may have drifted in and out of consciousness as his body struggled against the trauma. Slowly, his vital signs faded until, eventually, there was nothing left. It wasn't until much later that someone discovered what had happened. A family member or a passerby arrived at the farm and found him still caught in the machine. The scene was horrific, his body mangled by the auger, evidence of a battle he had no chance of winning. Emergency responders from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office and local rescue teams were called immediately, but there was no hope of saving him. The first responders carefully worked to free his body from the machinery before officially pronouncing him dead at the scene. The cause of death was ruled as massive trauma, blood loss, and mechanical asphyxiation due to compression injuries. His arm and shoulder were completely destroyed by the force of the auger. His ribcage had been crushed, and his internal organs were severely damaged. Lucky for him, he had likely lost consciousness within minutes, but it was impossible to determine how long he had remained aware before the shock took over. Authorities conducted an investigation into the accident, but there was no foul play or negligence involved. On the evening of January 16, 2018, 18-year-old David W. Colhas Jr. and a group of friends arrived at Sunday River Ski Resort in Newry, Maine. The resort was closed for the night, but the group had decided to enter the unauthorized areas to go tubing. Instead of using the designated tubing area, they made their way onto one of the ski slopes, which was off limits for such activities. The resort strictly prohibited tubing on ski trails due to the high speeds and lack of control on the compacted snow, but the group proceeded anyway, underestimating the dangers. Navigating through the resort grounds in the cold night air, they carried their inflatable tubes up one of the steep slopes. The snow had been compressed throughout the day by skiers and snowboarders, making the surface slick and much faster than a traditional tubing hill. Unlike designated tubing areas with barriers and controlled conditions, ski slopes were not designed for this kind of activity, especially at night. With no lights illuminating the run and no way to gauge obstacles ahead, the risks were significantly higher than they may have realized. At the top of the slope, David and his friend, 17-year-old Max, decided to share a tube. They settled onto the inflatable, adjusted their positions, and gave themselves a push. Within moments, they began accelerating down the icy trail, picking up more speed than expected. The combination of the steep gradient, slick surface, and the lack of proper control made it impossible to steer. Unlike sleds or snowboards, tubes offered no ability to slow down, turn, or stabilize, making them extremely dangerous on a ski slope. As they continued down the hill, their speed increased dramatically. The tube was no longer just gliding, it was plummeting uncontrollably. The icy snow beneath them made the ride unstable, and any shift in weight could send them spinning or veering off course. With no barriers, lights, or clear direction, the situation turned dangerous within seconds. The tube likely struck an uneven patch of snow or lost stability, causing them to slide toward the edge of the run. Before they had time to react, the tube crashed into a tree at high velocity. The force of the impact was immense. David, sitting at the front of the tube, bore the brunt of the collision. The impact was severe enough to cause massive blunt force trauma. His ribcage fractured instantly, likely puncturing his lungs and heart, causing immediate internal bleeding. The rapid deceleration would have resulted in catastrophic spinal injuries, possibly severing his spinal cord upon impact. His head likely struck either the tree itself or the hard-packed snow upon impact. The force of this would have caused skull fractures and traumatic brain injuries, which could have resulted in immediate loss of consciousness. The severity of his injuries meant that even with immediate medical intervention, survival would have been nearly impossible. Max, sitting behind David, also sustained serious injuries, but did not take the full force of the impact. He suffered multiple fractures and was in critical condition, but he survived. The reaction from their friends was immediate. Realizing something had gone terribly wrong, they rushed down the slope, slipping on the icy terrain as they reached the crash site. David was unresponsive, showing no signs of movement. Some of his friends attempted to shake him or call his name, but there was no response. Blood stained the snow around him, and his body was motionless. Panic set in. Some tried to check for a pulse, but in the confusion, it was difficult to determine whether he was still breathing. Max was severely injured but semi-conscious, groaning in pain. One of the friends pulled out their phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation as best as they could while trying to keep calm. Because the resort was closed and the ski patrol was not on duty, emergency services had to be dispatched from outside the resort, meaning it took time for help to arrive. The ski slope's remote location and the cold conditions further complicated the response efforts. paramedics and first responders arrived as quickly as possible, making their way up the slope with rescue sleds and medical equipment. They assessed David's condition first, but his injuries were catastrophic. There was no signs of life. His body was limp, his breathing had stopped, and his injuries were beyond what emergency personnel could treat. After a brief examination, paramedics confirmed that there was nothing they could do. David was pronounced dead at the scene. Max and another injured individual were carefully placed onto rescue sleds and transported down the mountain to waiting ambulances before being taken to a nearby hospital for emergency treatment. The friends who had remained at the scene were in shock, some crying, others standing in silence as they processed what had just happened. Authorities arrived to document the incident, interviewing the surviving friends to piece together what had led up to the crash. It was immediately clear that the group had entered an off-limit area and had been tubing on a closed ski slope. The resort's management later confirmed that the tubing was strictly prohibited on ski trails due to the extreme risk involved. The police ruled the incident as an accident, and no criminal charges were filed, not even trespassing. Following the accident, Sunday River Ski Resort made it clear about safety warnings, emphasizing the dangers of off-limit activities on the slopes. The resort had clear policies in place against tubing on ski trails, but this tragic event highlighted the consequences of not following those regulations.